Hi, I'm back again for another Sunday supplement, as I've been calling them on my blog, where I've been posting my conversations with Ed Dickerson, who has been generous enough to engage in a dialogue with me about how we read the book of Genesis and what that implies for what we think about the origins of the earth and ourselves as a species. It's been a really interesting dialogue, Ed. Thanks a lot, and thanks particularly that in the last video you showed me a little glimpse of the background of where you're coming from, not metaphorically but literally by showing me some images of where you live. It's interesting that in debates like this we often say that we're coming from very different places, and of course that's literally true as well, so it was really nice to see that glimpse of your home area and that lovely rolling farmland. So last week, Ed, you got into a lot of detail about the genealogies in Genesis, had some cool graphics, and talked about why they're there. And again, I totally agree with the thematic reason why they're there, that they're there to show descent through a righteous line that's faithful to God. I think this is true of a lot of the things that I wrestle with in the Bible, particularly in the early parts of the Old Testament. I can totally see from a literary and theological point of view why the stories are in there and that they make beautiful, beautiful points. But when I take them literally, I have more trouble with them. I mean, to move further ahead in Genesis than the creation narratives that we're talking about, the story of Lot's wife, metaphorically it works brilliantly. The idea that as you're moving away from an old life and from the things that were holding you back, if you'll ever look back or regret it, you're doomed. That's such a powerful and psychologically true message. But the idea that God actually turns this poor woman into a pillar of salt just because she wants a last glimpse back at her old house, I'm not sure I like that picture of God. But I don't want to get sidetracked into God condemning people to death or turning them to pillars of salt, because then we're into a whole other discussion, which is certainly interesting and maybe one we can have at some time, but it doesn't really belong here in this discussion of the Genesis creation narrative. But the genealogies do, because of course the genealogies in Genesis and throughout the rest of the Bible form the basis for Usher's famous chronology, which is how he figured out that the entire earth was roughly 6,000 years old. Now, while you can quibble about the details of Usher's math, I think it's pretty clear that if you take all of those as being literal lifespans of real people, and if you believe that they literally represent this was the father of this man who was the father of this man, then you are going to come up with a chronology that's relatively similar to Usher's. Now, you started one of your previous videos by saying that you didn't believe that necessarily all life on Earth was only about 6,000 years old. But if you take the genealogies and the ages of the patriarchs and the begats literally, then I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion. And that's an area that maybe you can clear up for me a little bit, Ed. I do understand that in literal reading of Genesis there is definitely room for the earth to be geologically much older than 6,000 years, because the Genesis creation story starts with an earth that's already present, already made, but without form and void. However, I don't see how a literal reading of Genesis allows for anything on earth to be biologically much older than about 7,000 years old. You talked about the impossibility of precisely being able to estimate the ages of fragments of ancient skeletons. Now, again, I'm out of my depth scientifically here. I was under the impression that when scientists tested old bones, old fossils, they were relatively able to get a general sense of about how old the person was, but I have no idea how they do that. I certainly have never heard anyone suggest that any human or humanoid remains ever found have been anything like 800 or 900 years old in terms of how long the organism lived. But I do know that they certainly have found human remains that seem to have gone back much, 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 much farther than the 6,000 or 7,000 years that it seems to me you're kind of stuck with if you take those begats and genealogies and the ages of the patriarchs literally. And of course, if Adam as the first human was created at the end of a literal 6-day creation week, then no plants or animals on Earth should be any older than that. And that seems to me so jarringly at odds with what science has found that despite my lack of scientific knowledge, it really causes me to have to hold the whole Genesis creation story in abeyance and say, well, again, back to where I was at the beginning, yes, I believe God created this earth. No, I really don't understand why the Genesis creation story doesn't line up with scientific findings. And maybe one of the explanations is that the story is not meant to be taken literally. The other issue that we talked about was that of so-called testing truths, and I'm glad you clarified what you meant by that in asking whether creationism was a testing truth. I guess my answer is that I don't think it ought to be. I don't think something as unknowable as how and when and by what process God created the earth should be something that causes a crisis in Christianity, but I think it is that, and it's being forced to be that by people who are insisting that a literal young earth six-day creationism is the only possible way to be faithful to the Bible. And I mean not just people within our own denomination, but certainly people across the whole swath of conservative Christianity who are forcing that to be a testing truth, and I think forcing a lot of faithful people who take scientific findings seriously to have to question or even abandon their faith, and I think that's a shame. The other question then would be, what do I think are testing truths? And you gave some good examples. I think there are issues in the church today that maybe are or deserve to be testing truths and that are driving us to a point of crisis. Some of those I will get to later on in my series about the fundamental doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but I really question whether six-day creation and a literal reading of Genesis is or ought to be one of those. I think it should be one of those issues on which we can agree to disagree, because even though we are both, and many, many others watching this hopefully are all faithful and dedicated Christians, we are, as I said at the beginning, coming from some very different places.